AMS Arifin Siddiqui, the Vice Chancellor of Dhaka University, to have accepted to open this conference. I'd like also to address my deepest gratitude to all the participants who came from 7 different countries in order to share their expertise during these 2 days conference. I'd like to thank also all the partners of this project, which has been initiated by Olivier Ludwig, Director of Alliance Française, and supported by all the team of Alliance Française Dhaka. I'd like to particularly thank the War Liberation Museum and the Ministry of War Liberation for being the partner of this event, along with the French Embassy, the Institut Français, the commemoration, the mission for the centenaire 14-18 in France, who is in charge of the commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the World War I, the ECPA, which is the archive of the French Ministry of Defense, Montagu French Fashion Lighting, as well as Jetco Limited, thanks to whom the whole project has been possible. As you know, yesterday the opening session of an exclusive photo exhibition showing the participation of the different colonies to the World War I was held in Alliance Française Dhaka, and the exhibition will continue till the 9th March in Alliance Française Dhaka, Dhanmondi. So you are all warmly invited to see this unique exhibition. I won't be very long in introducing this conference, since you'll be listening to some of the best experts from 7 different countries sharing their expertise on how the colonies' participation to the war was important, crucial, not only in their own history, but in the world, in making the world history. Olivier Ludwig's aim was at helping to fill a gap due to the lapse of memory regarding the participation of colonies in World War I. Among the many books published this year in France, none has actually dealt with the participation of colonies in the conflict. This lapse of memory, of course, is of great incidence in our perception of history. It affects particularly the former imperial powers such as France, Great Britain or Germany, but it also affects most of the colonies, including countries of South Asia. Very few people are aware of how important in terms of number of soldiers, laborers, of casualties, but also how important in terms of financial and material participation the role of their country was. The Great War both strengthened the colonial hold and weakened it. And in this respect, we hope that this event will help getting a grasp over the significance of the contribution of colonies and colonial troops to the war effort, as well as the importance of the Great War in dramatically altering the relationships between the colonizers and the colonized. We'll have 4 sessions from today to tomorrow, one dealing with the impact of the Great War on the colonies, with Professor Dr. Imtiaz Ahmed, who will talk about the reaction to the war by different personalities of the subcontinent, namely Tagore, Gandhi, and Eman Roy. Professor Dr. Mushirur Hassan from the National Archives of India is unwell and won't be able to take part to the seminar. We'll have Professor Dr. Gilbert Meunier, who will talk about the Algerians and the First World War after the tea break. And for the afternoon session, we will continue with this study of the impact of the Great War on the colonies, with Philip Orr will talk about Ireland and the First World War. Myself talking about the impact of the First World War on law and national sovereignty. Then we'll have Dr. Sayeda Rosanna Rashid from the University of Dhaka, who will specially talk about the implication of labor migrations between and from colonies. And we'll conclude this first day with Professor Dr. Iftekhar Iqbal from the University of Dhaka, who will talk about the environmental impact of World War I. And tomorrow, the conference will be dedicated to the uses of the colonies from propaganda to memory, with Professor Dr. Chris Manjapara from Tufts University, Professor Dr. Richard Fogarty from the University of Albany, and Professor Frederick Rousseau, Dr. Reinhard Bendick, and we will conclude the conference with a session dedicated to Bengal in the Great War, with Squadron Leader Rana China, Dr. Kaushik Roy, Lieutenant Colonel Muhammad Lutful Haq, and Mofidul Haq from the Liberation War Museum in Dhaka. Thanks to all of you for being here. The question session will be held at the end of each session. Now I'm inviting His Excellency, the Ambassador of the European Union to Dhaka, Mr. William Hanna, to come and deliver his inaugural speech to the conference. Thank you, Your Excellency.
Honorable Vice-Chancellor, professors, teachers, distinguished guests, students, I'm very happy to be here this morning at this conference. We've just been having a little bit of a chat with the Vice-Chancellor about an interesting beginning of a discussion about history. I have to confess at the moment I studied history, but I cannot say I'm an historian. So what I have to say now may be completely controversial, but anyway, I'll say a few things about history as I see it. I wanted to say a few things first about dates, then something about official history and reality. I see the theme is picked up in some of the abstracts. I want to say something about the origins of the European Union, because the European Union comes after the experiences of the wars of the last century, and finish with something about the relevance of history today. First of all, dates. I've always had a fascination for dates, and I remember when I was in my primary school in Belfast, I got a prize for knowing the dates of the kings and queens of England. I loved that, and I was good at that. Dates were the sort of history that I found at that stage very easy, simple, incontrovertible facts, or so it seemed at the time. So here we are today in 2014, and 100 years ago, the start of the First World War. And 700 years ago, 1314, the Battle of Bannockburn. And the Scots will be being reminded of that battle this year as they decide later on this year whether to remain in the United Kingdom or to seek independence. Dates are important, and we celebrate them. And for the English, it may be 1066, the Battle of Hastings, which took place on the 14th of October, 1066, to be precise. And which also gave rise to that book. I don't know if you know the book 1066 and all that. I always thought that was a great book. a book. It's a skit on history which purports to contain all the history you can remember in 62 chapters, covers the history of England from Roman times through 1066 and all that, up to the end of World War I, at which time, quotes, America was clearly top nation and history came to a full stop. And I think that's the end, full stop. The Battle of Hastings. For the Irish, I'm from Belfast, so for the Irish, dates are very important to us, and some in Northern Ireland celebrate the 12th of July, 1690, when a famous battle was supposed to take place. Actually, they're wrong. It didn't take place on the 12th of July. It took place on the 1st of July, because the calendar was changed after that. And 1st of July, 1916, is also the Battle of the Somme, when many of my fellow countrymen died, some of them having been promised and believing that they were fighting to stay within the United Kingdom. Similar themes. But just a few months earlier was the Easter Rising in Dublin, when many Irishmen of a different persuasion took advantage of the First World War and raised the banner for a free Ireland. They were executed, and as W.B. Yeats wrote, a terrible beauty was born. I'm fascinated with what Philip Orr may have to say about these different episodes in Irish history, what happened and how they continue to reflect how we think about ourselves. Here in Bangladesh, we were talking, dates are also very, very important in this country. I was here in the university very recently for Ekushi February, which we were celebrating here on the university's premises, so dates are very important. But okay, dates were the first thing which I loved about history, but there comes a point when you begin to ask yourself questions about the official history and what really happened. And we had an interesting Hay Festival here. I don't know if some of you participated in the Hay Festival recently, and Tariq Ali was there giving his version of events. And I picked up one of his books, and I noted this from something he wrote. He said, official history is mainly composed of half-truths and outright lies, in which everything is attributed to well-meaning rulers and noble pious settlements. Those who write this are worshippers of accomplished facts, rallying to the side of the victors. Sometimes a general, sometimes a politician. Success justifies everything. There is another history that refuses to be repressed. So there comes a point when we begin to ask ourselves questions about the history which we were given. For me, that point came later on at school when we were studying the poems of Wilfred Owen. And you study the poems of Wilfred Owen and you learn about the horrors of World War I and the trench warfare. And that reality of the war has been brought home to me many times as I've been posted in different countries around the world. In Belgium, in France, I've been posted in Africa, in Tanzania, and in Uruguay, and here in Bangladesh, and everywhere. In all these countries, you can find the cemeteries of the wars, in every one of them. And when you go there, you find these beautiful places. I went to Comilla for Remembrance Day of a couple of months ago. Beautiful graveyard, and you look down at the stones and you ask yourself, what brought all these young men from all over the world to die in a foreign country? You ask yourself that question. Many young men of 20. Canadians and Australians lying in the graves in France or Gallipoli. West Africans in Comilla. And Sikh soldiers captained by a young Ulsterman in Burma. Millions died in the Great War, which was a war to end wars, but it didn't end wars. It was soon followed by a wider Second World War in which many more millions were killed. And of course, there were many who survived and who had gone to that war believing in a cause or believing in promises and came back, and often these promises were not fulfilled. So in 1914, or after 1914, at that time, the world changed fundamentally. Empires were destroyed. Other empires suffered fatal blows. And today, we still live with the consequences. Very clearly, the maps that were drawn after that First World War, we still live with the consequences right now. Syria, Iraq, of what happened then. Here in Dhaka, my job is to represent the European Union. And the story, the simple history, which you can accept or not, but the simple story we tell about the EU is that the idea came from the survivors of the Second World War, who learnt the lessons of those two wars and who said never again. They realized that at that time, after the Second World War, with the bomb, a further world war would be the end, would destroy Europe completely. And so they took steps to integrate the people of Europe, our peoples, our economies, so completely that we would not think of waging war again. Wars are often thought about freedom or the freedom of peoples over nations, but the founding fathers of the European Union created new European freedoms. Freedoms of people to travel, freedom of goods, freedom of services, which led to new freedoms at a European level, which people now in Europe take for granted, but not something which they had before. And I think many young people in Europe actually take it for granted. They don't know where it comes from. And last year we were reminded by the Nobel Prize, which the European Union was awarded for peace, reminding us of what the project was all about. The European Union is a simple idea, but it's been incredibly successful, and it's been said that it's the response of the second half of the last century to the problems of the first half of the century. And it has given us 70 years of peace and prosperity in Europe. And it's a model, that model of working together, which we believe is even more relevant today in our globalized world, where so many problems can only be dealt by nations coming together and discussing them and working together and seeing what they have in common. And to take one example, climate change. An example where we work very closely with Bangladesh in international negotiations. The European Union is taking the lead in trying to reduce the emissions. Bangladesh is taking the lead amongst the least developed countries in trying to bring together and have at an international level agreement. And so in today's world, that idea that countries no longer fight, but they have to work together to address the problems that are facing this generation and next generations, I think is still relevant. And so I think history is still relevant. It didn't come to a full stop after the First World War, as Sellers and Yeatman said. We're still writing it today, and we can still today learn many new things about the past. And even, we can learn things that we didn't know. For example, did you know that Gandhi was not only in favor of the war, of the First World War, but he actively campaigned to urge Indians to join up and fight for the British Empire? Did you know that? I read it in the paper, but I learnt it last year. I learnt it last year when I visited Anand in Gujarat, and I learnt that my grandfather had met Gandhi there in 1915 and stood on the same platform. So history can surprise you, even many, many years, even a century afterwards, with what it throws up and with the controversial idea, but it's more complicated sometimes than it looks. And I think it was later that Gandhi changed perhaps his views and saw the empire as the problem. I stand ready to be corrected on that, but I have my story, and it comes from my family. So there we are, some of my ideas about dates, about history, about how that First World War, certainly, how deeply it affected not only Europe, but all over the world. How the European Union comes out of that experience. That's why we're here today. That's why we're trying to work together. Thank you very much for your attention to listening to an amateur historian, and I'll be very interested to listen to the professional historians afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. And just to add a small word about history in the making and distortion. Very recently, I was conducting some research on some colonial atlas to check the French presence in nowadays Bangladesh, at that time Bengal. And there was an introduction word of this colonial atlas by Maréchal Lyoté, who was reminding how important had been the colonies' role in the First World War, telling that France is a country of 40 million citizens, but it's a colonial empire of 100 million inhabitants, and that the success in the war was really thanks to the contribution of the colonies. And at a time when many people tend to try to bring forward the benefits for the colonies of the colonization by European nations, it is quite important to reassess the contribution of the colonies to the European nations and to the colonial powers. Now, I'm calling Professor Dr. AMS Arefin Siddiqui, Vice Chancellor of Dhaka University, to come and give his inaugural speech to the conference. Thank you, Professor.
Ambassador William Hanna, Professor Samuel Bechte, My dear colleagues and students, distinguished guests, dear participants from home and overseas, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum. Let me begin by welcoming all of you to lush green campus of Dhaka University, one of the few historical sites in Dhaka that is tinged with colonial history. It is my privilege to welcome scholars of international repute from different parts of the globe who, I am sure, will get involved in critical discourses on colonial encounter and its aftermath. I thank the organizer for arranging this wonderful event and tagging it with a rare photo exhibition. Confident the conference will raise interesting issues, generate new ideas which will form foundation for further research and critical reflection. Ladies and gentlemen, every war has its casualties. Given the fact that the First World War is so distant from us, both in terms of time and space, we might think that it had nothing to do with us. The war's centenary celebration and the rare archived photo exhibition have given us occasions to prove us wrong. The involvement of the colonies, the tales of trauma and turbulences have remained frozen in time for a long time, at least in our part of the world. The partition of India in 1947 and the emergence of new countries following the Second World War has dominated local discourses. Somehow, the centenary observation has made us aware of the intricate connection between what were once the mother countries and their colonies. Under colonialism, the colonies not only supplied logistics and manpower for the war, they also bled with their rulers. Sometimes they had little to do with the ideological battle in which they were cogs in the war machine. So when an event like this conference reminds us of the loss of 90,000 Indian soldiers out of a total of 1.5 million who took part in the First World War, we begin to realize how monstrous and brutal the epoch-changing war was. Our national poet, Kazi Nazrul Islam, was recruited as a soldier during the war. In one of his essays titled, "I Am a Soldier," he identified the beast that resided in all of us. War is normally seen as a projection of our bestial selves that destroy the human one. Distinguished guests, in an academic discussion, we can glorify war and say that the First World War resulted in contacts between the European soldiers with soldiers from the colonies. Such cultural exchanges changed the mindsets of Europe and eventually led to the independence of different colonies. Others would argue that the war was just another layer of oppression. I am sure scholars gathered here will brainstorm these issues and proffer us guidance how to avoid similar conflicts in the future. After all, we live in a world that cannot afford to wage another massive war. In Bangladesh, we understand the pains of war. During our liberation war, we lost 3 million of our population. We should always shun war and preach peace, practice peace throughout the world for the betterment of entire mankind. Ladies and gentlemen, I will end with a personal regret though. For Dhaka University, the First World War had different implications. Robert Nathan, a London-based barrister, was heading a 13-member commission to explore the merit of having a separate university in the then East Bengal. We have assembled here today at this Senate Hall, named after Nawab Ali Chowdhury, another honored member of the Nathan Commission. The proposal of having a university in Dhaka was seen as a compensation for the division of Bengal in 1905. Despite the opposition raised by Kolkata-based intellectuals, Robert Nathan submitted his report in 1913 in favor of the establishment of a university in Dhaka. However, his recommendations got hung up once the war erupted. The frozen file was reactivated when World War I was over, and the university got underway on 1st of July in 1921. I guess, ladies and gentlemen, if not the war had happened, we would have celebrated the centenary of Dhaka University today instead of the First World War centenary. You would have been sitting here talking not about the colonial defeat, but about the glorious academic feat of Dhaka University in the last 100 years. The war delayed our celebration by some years. With these few words, ladies and gentlemen, I now declare the two-day international conference on war and colonies 1914-1918 formally open, and wish the conference all success. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your time and attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Siddiqui, Vice Chancellor of Dhaka University. Now we are going to proceed directly for the first session, and the first speaker I'm calling is Professor Dr. Imtiaz Ahmed from the University of Dhaka, to give an exhaustive presentation of Professor Dr. Imtiaz Ahmed would require a conference in itself. I think is well known to all of you. He's Professor of International Relations and also Director, Center for Genocide Studies. He has actually got many prestigious fellowships in different universities and research centers. He has authored 17 books and 6 monographs. I will not give the account of all the articles he has published. We are very honored that he accepted to give his contribution to this conference. He will deal with a very interesting and more complex topic than what it could seem. It means the reception and the reaction to the World War I by leading intellectuals of Bengal, namely Tagore, not only Bengal, sorry, of the subcontinent, Tagore, Gandhi, and Eman Roy. This is my Bengali kind of tropism, which talk. Not only the Bengali, the political leaders of the subcontinent, and he will draw the attention on the diverse approaches and the diverse reactions to the World War I. We tend to show, for instance, Gandhiji and Tagore as being totally in line when it comes to the vision for the subcontinent, and quite often I think a detailed study would prove that it is not as simple as that. They were intellectuals, philosophers, and also politicians with maybe pursuing the same goals, but having definitively a different perception of the reality and the way to achieve it. And that's also the case, I believe, for Eman Roy. So I invite now Professor Dr. Imtiaz Ahmed to come and deliver his speech. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the good words. The two chairs actually, and my friends out there, my students, all of you. Well, I have a longish paper. What I will do is try to speak 20-25 minutes. You know, if you give a Bengali the mic, he can actually continue for hours. So you have to be very careful, and it's a risky business giving a Bengali the mic actually, and more so an academic in fact. But I will try to speak 20-25 minutes, and then let's see what happens after that. As you know, the title is Tagore, Gandhi, and Roy, and the reason I took these 3 particular authors because during the First World War and also before that, they reacted interestingly, because in the whole of South Asia, undivided India that we had, it was under British colonialism, a little bit of French colonialism as well, and a little bit of Portuguese colonialism as well, if you take Pondicherry and Goa. So they were European colonialism, so to say. And I guess the three, giants, well, two are Bengalis, in fact. You can't help, not having the Bengali Babus, in fact, dictating the rest of South Asia. They used to say what Bengal thinks today, rest of India thinks tomorrow. That was Gokhale's statement way back. But two Bengalis, Tagore and Eman Roy, and Gandhi being a Gujarati, contributed immensely. And the reason I thought that we should speak about these three particular personalities, their contribution, the writing at, exactly during those times, because they still remain relevant, and that's extraordinary, even after 100 years. Tagore had a poem way back in 1900 about, what will be, whether you will remember after 100 years or not. And he was quite sure that he will be remembered. But I guess he thought more in terms of his songs and poems. But it seems that he's still relevant in the context of social science that we refer to. Anyway, let me start by citing Karl Marx's a statement in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. You see, Marx said something which is interesting in 1852, and I guess some of you will be knowing this statement, but let me cite that. Karl Marx is saying, men make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all the dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living. Full stop. You see, if you look at the Marxist discourse after that, a lot of people focused more on the circumstances, but not on the first 3 or 4 words, men make their own history. And this is important, and he ended by saying, on the brain of the living. You see, humans are not only Homo sapiens, we are Homo sapiens, we are thinking being, but we are also Homo faber, we are creative being. There was an interesting debate between Tagore and Einstein. Einstein, being a scientist, believed in objective reality independent of human consciousness, but Tagore said, no human, no table, no moon, no beauty. Tagore said, well, with beauty I can understand. But you are saying no table, no moon, nothing? He said, no, because the human only knows the moon, because we really don't know whether the ants and the cows look at the moon the way we do the moon, in fact, okay? And at the end, in fact, Einstein had to say that it seems that I am more religious than you. Now, this is important, the debate, because it puts the human at the center. So, without humans or without men making history, their own history, you are not going to go very far, in fact. So, whatever we are saying today and the way we look at this world is because there are humans, in fact. When the humans would not be there, I'm afraid this will all become nothing. Now, the reason of saying this is, and in the context of anti-colonial resistance, all these three personalities actually reacted very strongly on the issue of anti-colonial resistance. Now, this resistance is not because of World War I, it predates, it goes before World War I, in fact. And one could start from way back in 1857 when we had the first Sepoy Mutiny, or what is known as First War of Independence, India's first war of independence. Now, one can easily ask a simple question, why in 1857 we failed? Well, one of the reasons a revolution or a rebellion can fail is because you do not have a discourse to carry it, in fact. You need a discourse, in fact. Now, there is nothing called spontaneity, in fact. If you are familiar with Gramsci's writing, he was very critical, because sometimes when it says spontaneous revolution, it seems that, it happens suddenly. Gramsci was saying, no, what it lacks is documentation. because documentation actually creates discourses. You would not have Bangladesh, for example, to, most of us here are Bangladeshis, to give an understanding. Unless you had the 6 point and the discourse, the nationalist discourse, Tagore, Nazrul, Jamanandu Das, if you did not have that discourse, you could not have created something called Bangladesh or any other, one can talk about France and Germany and whole of Europe in that light. So you need a discourse. 1857 lacked that discourse, in fact, or lacked that documentation. The leadership did not have the discourse. Yes, it was a revolt, it was a rebellion, but what they were aiming for. Now that aiming for the discourse, I will say, really got well established with the personalities that I'm referring to, Tagore, Gandhi, and Einstein. Sorry, Tagore, Gandhi, and Eman Roy. Now, let me very quickly talk of all these three authors to give you a sense. Interestingly, they differed immensely. There's an interesting debate between Tagore and Gandhi, not so much with Eman Roy, but it's interesting, at the same time, you could have two Bengalis absolutely in two streams, in fact. Nothing be so different between Tagore and Eman Roy. It would be, one would be 180 degree, upside down. So you can have the same circumstance, and that's besides the reason I think the Marxist statement people are focusing on a wrong context. Not that the circumstances are not important, but the same circumstances can actually contribute to totally different discourses. That is what I'm trying to make, because men and women make history and make life interesting. Now Tagore, even earlier than 1917, he had this 1917 book, Nationalism, which came out of 2 lectures in Japan and the United States. But his kind of imaginative understanding of politics, if I can say, came out in 1899 or 1900. And he has an interesting poem, in fact, which Bengalis, I believe, did not understand at that particular time, his critique of nation and nationalism. Only in 1917, I believe, they understood a little bit, but that was too late. And I will just cite this particular poem to give you an understanding, and then I'll come back to his book on nationalism. This is what he says on the last day of the 19th century. Now, this is Tagore's own translation, and I will tell you the translation is far better than the original Bangla, because I can, myself knowing, the translation really came out what he was trying to say in the context of nation and nationalism, which the Bangla translation actually, the Bangla original actually misses. It is his translation that I am reciting now. This is what he says at the last day of the 19th century, and I quote, "The last sun of the century sets amid the blood-red clouds of the west and the whirlwind of hatred. The naked passion of self-love of nations, in its drunken delirium of greed, is dancing to the clash of steel and howling verses of vengeance. The hungry self of the nation shall burst in a violence of fury from its shameless feeding, for it has made the world its food, and licking it, crunching it, and swallowing it in big morsels, it swells and swells, till in the midst of its unholy fist descends the sudden shaft of heaven, piercing its heart of grossness," unquote. It came almost like from inside, even the translation. Now, this is interesting because when he took his poetic understanding into prose and gave the lectures in Japan and the United States, by then he already got his Nobel Prize. When he wrote his poem, he did not. He got his Nobel Prize in 1913. So when he went in 1916 and 1917 to lecture USA and Japan, hundreds turned out actually to listen to him. But after his lecture, when he left, there was only the host to see him off at the airport, because they did not like his lectures at all. He was so critical of nation and nationalism. And let me just cite from his book on nationalism, the lectures that he delivered in Japan and the United States. This is what he has to say about nationalism. And I quote, "India has never had a real sense of nationalism. Even though from childhood I had been taught that adultery of the nation is almost better than reverence for God and humanity. I believe I have outgrown that teaching, and it is my conviction that my countrymen will truly gain their India by fighting against the education which teaches them that a country is greater than the ideals of humanity. I am not against one nation in particular, but against the general idea of all nations. What is the nation? It is the aspect of a whole people as an organized power. This organization incessantly keeps up the insistence of the population on becoming strong and efficient. But this strenuous effort after strength and efficiency drains man's energy from his higher nature, where he is self-sacrificing and creative. For thereby man's power of sacrifice is diverted from his ultimate object, which is moral, to the maintenance of this organization, which is mechanical. Nationalism is a great menace. It is the particular thing which for years has been at the bottom of India's troubles," unquote. Now this is he's saying in 1916-17, and you can almost read the book that he was warning whole of the world that believe, your Second World War is coming. Get out of this demonic. He says this is nation and nationalism is a demonic thing in fact. But way back then nobody listened to him. Even 3 months died in 1941, he kept on repeating, in his one of his other important lecture called Crisis in Civilization, Shobhota Shankot. And he points out in that particular lecture also at the end that get away from this nation and nationalism. This is not going to go very far. And then he says, and let me say in Bangla first, মানুষের প্রতি বিশ্বাস হারানো পাপ সে বিশ্বাস আমি আজীবন রাখবো. Only I shall not commit the grievous sin of losing faith in humans. So he was putting center thing that you need to invest on the humans and not all these abstract and mechanical kind of things. To the point when he was asked whether he was a patriot, he says that I am not a patriot. I seek compatriots throughout the world. And then he says, yes, I love India, but my India is an idea and not a geographical expression, full stop. And this he wrote while in Paris actually, which is interesting, given the fact that, we have Parisians in this room. So the fact here is this particular debate continues even today. It has not died down. Nation and nationalism, whether in South Asia, look in Africa, look at the different. The only interesting part is, as we could hear the ambassador saying, Europe has overcome that in an interesting way and created an interesting thing called European Union out of almost the ashes of nation and nationalism. Now, do we have to follow that model? I have no, I think the model is fine. The only problem is whether we should follow the process, because if the process is to be followed, then it's a deadly one, because the number of people that got killed and such a bloody thing, whether we should follow the process or whether without following the process we can come to that level or not. That's the argument that remains. Now let's take Gandhi. In fact, Gandhi came out interestingly in a book, Hinshaw Raj, in 1909, which is very interesting. When Tagore read this book, Hinshaw Raj, he actually sent Charles Andrews. You see, in the film Gandhi, they give an impression that Gokhale sent Charles Andrews, which is not true actually. History shows very clearly it was Tagore, because Charles Andrews was working in Shantiniketan. He sent Charles Andrews away to South Africa that bring this man, he has much to contribute in India and not, just stay in South Africa after reading Hinshaw Raj. Now, what is interesting in Hinshaw Raj, Gandhi does almost what Rabindranath does. He brings the issue of civilization. civilization not understood in the European sense. This is an interesting one, not something that you make a small thing big, in fact. And Tagore, time and again, pointing out that the word civilization is missing. You know, we don't have the word civilization. But what the West understands by civilization, the nearest word, and this is what Tagore is writing, the nearest word that comes to our mind in South Asia is the word dharmo. Now this is interesting. Dharmo today is now translated as religion, but dharmo and religion are absolutely far apart. The etymology is totally different. The etymology of religion is from Latin religio, which means to link, to bind, whereas dharmo comes from the Sanskrit word dhar and plasma, as the mother will hold the child. That's the understanding of dharma. So in our daily conversation, we do say that you keep your dharma and I keep my dharma. Each and every person, Gandhi used to say, each and every person has his own dharma. Now dharma is near to what Manu, if you are familiar with Manu's understanding of Sadachar, proper conduct. And this is precisely what Gandhi is trying to say in Hinshaw Raj, that when we talk of civilization, we understand Sadachar, we understand proper conduct, because in Gujarati also we have the same equivalent word. Now what he does in Hinshaw Raj, this is a dialogue. Now interestingly, don't forget that in South Asia dialogues are important. Dialogues actually have created religion. The whole of Hinduism, in fact, if you are familiar with Bhagavad Gita, it is dialogue, the supreme dialogue between Arjuna and Lord Krishna. And that is all, in fact, which has established religion called Hinduism, and the book called Bhagavad Gita, which is part of the big epic called Mahabharata. He takes that dialogue formulation and writes the Hinshaw Raj. So it would be very difficult to know whether it is the editor or the reader which is Gandhi. It's almost like in Bhagavad Gita, in fact, you know, sometime Lord Krishna could be on the other side, sometime Arjuna could be on the other side. It's a fascinating dialogue which really makes you think whether the divinity lies with Krishna or whether the divinity lies with, with Arjuna. Gandhi used to say that no, it is in the mind of the author, Vyas. You know, don't take literally the war, the just war, the juddha. You know, it's the mind which, you have. And he takes that into Hinshaw Raj in an interesting way. And what he argues, and this is his arguing a time, and it became very important gradually of his writings during the First World War, is that the means and end have to be identical. The upaya and upayo have to be identical. You cannot have Machiavellian understanding of thing, in fact, that end will justify the means. And he was very critical throughout his life. Now this is important. He's saying if the end is peace, if the end is non-violent, you cannot have the means violent. If the means is violent, then you will end up also with a violent end. And I guess, looking at First World War and Second World War, you can see, yes, the First World War ended, but then it gave birth to Second World War. Well, we hopefully, we are not into Third World War, but then given the kind of weapons that we have built, where humans now can destroy the world, not once, with all the nuclear weapons I'm talking about, can actually destroy the world 9 times. Divine wanted to destroy only once. We have already, outreached the divine, in fact, challenging the divine. Now, this is the central part, and he takes the meaning from Bhagavad Gita and creates into a political discourse that end and means, the upaya and upaya have to be identical. And he kept it, in fact. So when he had this, non-violent, non-cooperation movement, the Hartal that we talk about, when it ended in violence, it stopped, in fact. Although the Congress were critical of him, saying that, look, we can have the independence now. The British got terrified. He said, no, I'm not going to make Hindustan into Englistan, in fact. I'm not interested in just getting rid of the English, in fact. I am interested in getting rid of the idea of colonialism. If the idea is in the head, then you had it. Now, very quickly, so you have this accommodation of contradictory forces, if you can say, that you accommodate the contradictions. Now, this is within Bhagavad Gita, in fact. Vyas actually, if you look at the number of religious discourses that he brought together, it's absolutely fascinating. Now, here in Bhagavad Gita, you will see, Vedic Brahmanism, Upanishadic Monism, Shankha dualism, Yoga Shastra, Bhagavad theism, all he brought together and created what later came to be known as Neo-Brahmanism or Hinduism. It's different from the classical or ancient Brahmanism. And this is a contribution of Vyas. Similarly, what Gandhi wanted to do was to bring all the contradictory forces together. And his ingenuity was to bring the Muslims also. So in his ashram, he had no problem in the morning having recitations from Bhagavad Gita, from Bible, from Tripitaka, from the Holy Quran. So when he was asked this question in Gujarat, which is a predominantly Hindu locality, when he was asked, Bapuji, give us an example, a modern example of Ram Rajyo. You're talking about, kingdom of Lord Ram, which is ancient, we don't know. Give us a modern example. Is there a modern example? To the shock of the audience, he said, yes, there is a modern example. The entire room got silenced. And then he said, the period of Hazrat Abu Bakr and Hazrat Umar are the period of Ram Rajyo. You could easily see why Nathuram Godse decided to kill this man. Because that's, you go beyond, accommodating the contrary forces. Here, the first two caliphs of the Islamic world, Hazrat Umar and Hazrat Abu Bakr, and he's saying that is what Ram Rajyo is all about. So you can see how he was trying to accommodate the contradictory forces, and that discourse still remains central, I believe, whether with Martin Luther or whether with Mandela, and you can talk about X number of other personalities throughout the world have tried their best to accommodate the contradictory forces, and I will even point out the Chinese are also very good at that in accommodating forces, which we can talk maybe during the discussion. The last one, and very quickly, in fact, I guess I've taken a lot of time, is Eman Roy. Now, Eman Roy in 1952 wrote something which I think will make you understand how he differed from Gandhi and Tagore. In 1952, well matured and all, because he died 2 years after in 1954, he says, I was born as Narendra Nath Bhattacharya and adopted the name of Eman Roy while in the United States of America, full stop. He changed his name also. Eman Roy was easy, I guess, to pronounce. I remember one of my friends, when I went to Australia, his name was Hidayatullah. And then I suddenly heard that Alan Khan is calling you. I said, who is this Alan Khan? So he changed his name from Hidayatullah to Alan Khan. And I said, why did you do that? He said, no, everybody started calling me Heda, which he didn't like it, in fact. Heda, and Heda can be, in Bengali can be also problematic. So he changed into Alan Khan. So I don't know whether Narendra Nath Bhattacharya had the same problem or not, but what I am getting into, that he was an arch-modernist. You see, Gandhi and Tagore were anarchists, in fact. When I say anarchist, in fact, you are outside the arc, outside the circle. They didn't want to make a center. They always wanted to make this center. And this is what we get with Derrida and Foucault with post-structuralism and postmodernity later on, in a way, in 20th century. But both Tagore and Gandhi were actually, critiquing the arc. And for that reason, they were anarchists, in fact. And we have a paper of Qazi Nazrul Islam here. I hope, we can have discussion, because he too, I believe, was an anarchist who was trying to get out of the center, in fact. But not Eman Roy. Eman Roy believed in the center, believed in the modernist understanding of things, the linear understanding of history, and to learn from that. So he sees colonialism's power, the strength, the militancy, and he says, okay, the only way we can get rid of the British is by taking the instruments of the British, in fact. And he started very early on with, the revolutionaries and all. This was the time when the terrorism came up. Don't forget, the Bengal terrorists and the Narodniks were fighting actually to be who can be the first terrorist in the world, modern terrorist, in fact. We still do, in fact, because, Narodniks claim that they were the first one, because you have in 1897, they assassinated Alexander II, whereas in the Bombay presidency, the two British, one civilian and a British military officer were assassinated also, and that was in 1897, whereas the assassination of Alexander II was in 1881. At the same time, but there are literature which will say some people give credit to the Narodniks as the first modern terrorists, whereas Bengal terrorists are not also lagging behind. Now, he was part of the Bengal terrorists, in fact, and this he kept in an interesting way, to the point that when all these, terrorism failed, terrorism is bound to fail today or tomorrow anyway, because the problem with terrorism is that you don't have the people with you. You can't have, a revolution without the people, in fact. So that is a serious problem. So it failed, but then he did not stop, in fact, because his head absolutely got infected with this idea that what I need is weapons to get rid of a counter weapon. So he went to Japan, he went to China, met Sun Yat-sen, talked to German ambassadors, and then landed up in the United States, in fact. Now, in the USA, after United States joins the First World War, because the reason why he went to the United States, early on, because the United States was neutral in the beginning, as you know, and when on 6th April 1917, the US declared war on Germany, Eman Roy comes up with a letter, an interesting letter, a big letter actually, it's a kind of a monograph, and he writes to His Excellency Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States of America. Now, if you read that particular lecture, you will see there are three things. One is he's virulently anti-British. Tagore and Gandhi were not, as I said, anti-British in the sense of the idea, but not in terms of personalities. And this is what Eman Roy is saying. The movement, the Indian nationalist movement, which aims at liberating India, is as old as the British Empire. The British tyranny in India, founded on perfidy, falsity, and perjury, and maintained by means of brutal force, has been hated universally by the Indians. There is no such hate in Tagore and Gandhi, because they were telling that you cannot get rid of another hate by your hate. That is a no-no to the, to other authors. Now, this is interesting because he ends, and I will end by one of his statements. He ends a year after this particular letter to Woodrow Wilson. He writes a big piece, and the title is India, Her Past, Present, and Future. And he ends with an interesting kind of a thing, which I believe is still relevant today. People who still think that you can counter militancy or counter terror with a counter terror, or you can, contain terror with counter terror, or whatever it is. This is what he says. India will be free sooner or later. And he's writing this in December 1918. India will be free sooner or later, not through the kindness of the English rulers, but through her own energy. Unfortunately, to achieve this goal, India will have to go against the teachings of the prophets and temporarily the glorious tradition of our history. A war for true liberty will have to be initiated. The aim of this conflict will be the final termination of the arrogant rule of one part of humanity over another. So what he's trying to do, he wants to bring back the machine of the colonial power in order to get rid of the colonial power. Now you can see that discourse is still there, whether in the form of Frantz Fanon in Africa, in different ways, even today. It is a living thing, and not to mention with the rise of the terrorism, throughout. People will say Eman Roy is more relevant than Gandhi and Tagore, because Gandhi and Tagore is more, it requires quite an intellectual strength, not to mention a kind of tolerance and kind of understanding, which people have less patience for. And it is Eman Roy, I think, who would be credited more, probably at the end. And this Eman Roy ended up at the point going way from the United States and meeting way to Stalin, joining the Comintern, but then he ended up as a Marxist at the end, but he differed from Stalin nonetheless. But let me conclude very quickly by saying what are the things that we can get out of these three big personalities and their writings. One, resistance can be creative. This is important. I don't think we should lose hope, and Europe probably has given a kind of a sense to the understanding of European Union. It's very important the people who worked immediately after Second World War, if I can say. Because I think, as the ambassador was saying, that not again, but you need a tremendous creativity to create a kind of structure with two, arch enemies. But I believe resistance can be creative, in fact, and my hope lies because, even in Bangladesh and in South Asia, we do have pockets of what you call eye for eye kind of a situation. At home we have with the political parties, but even in South Asia, if you take India and Pakistan, if that is the case, I will tell my young students, you should not lose hope, because I think this is the best creative moment you can have by looking at all these contradictions and coming out of there and do something what Tagore or Gandhi or even I will say Eman Roy did. The second one is the same circumstances can produce streams, in fact, and that is important to understand, that where a human can make a difference. It is not a question that the same circumstances you will end up with same kind of people. Divine has created us differently. And that, I think, is important to understand. We are homo faciens, in fact. And if that is the case, I think the space for imagination can be, expanded. And I think that is where marvel lies. If you remember Einstein's famous statement, imagination is more important than knowledge. That imagination, I believe, is a central element, and you can see what a proliferation of imagination with Gandhi and Tagore and Eman Roy at that particular time. You may debate a little bit with Eman Roy in the context that it is not so much an imagination, it's a kind of replication, but look at Gandhi or look at even Tagore, even in that point, trying to say, I am not a patriot, I seek compatriots throughout the world. You require quite a guts, in fact. Or even Gandhi, in fact, not raising the flag on 1947, when whole of India on 15th August 1947 was celebrating the independence and raising flag. The only place where the flag was not raised deliberately was in Gandhi's ashram. He said, this is not the Swaraj that I want. And the last thing I will say, that all three discourses are relevant. You cannot get out of that, in fact. And it is important to understand the past, to see where they were. They bring a rich tradition, and I think it's not something that you can impose very quickly. You also need to creatively get out of that discourse and have your own discourse. That much I can understand, but it is important to go back and read all the stuff in an interesting way, and in the context now that we have 100 years of war, where you can see France and Germany have transformed, absolutely, mind-boggling, kind of a thing. I guess some of the members, whether Hitler or other, would have committed suicide probably in any way, looking at the friendship that France and Germany has done in 100 years. I believe humans are creative beings, and that is where our hope lies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Imtiaz Ahmed. I'm sure you'll have many interesting questions to ask to Professor Imtiaz Ahmed, but we are going to break for tea, come back at 12 o'clock. Then we will listen to Professor Dr. Gilbert Meunier talking about Algerians and the First World War, and then we'll open the debate and we'll open the floor to questions regarding these two papers. Thank you very much.